In the winter of 1903, the church bells of Greyhaven rang out for the last time. That Sunday morning, 67 men, women, and children stepped through the wooden doors of the Hudson family church. They prayed, they sang, and by nightfall, they were gone. All of them. Their coats still hung on pegs. The pews were warm, but the congregation had vanished, leaving only silence and the faint smell of perfume. The camera lingers on abandoned pews, hymnals half open and a cracked altar bathed in shadows. A child's shoe lies alone on the floor, as if dropped mid-step. The voice continues, steady and unnerving. The Hudson family called it divine rapture. The locals whispered something else, that the church was no sanctuary at all, but a house of flesh and deception. They said the sermons were just hymns to mask the cries from beneath the floorboards. They said the velvet-curtained basement was not holy ground, but a brothel for men of influence, judges, bankers, even pastors themselves. For 8 seconds the opening sears into the mind, half faith, half horror. The lines between worship and corruption blurred until no one could tell the difference. And then the revelation. The grim history of the Hudson family begins here, with a church that was never truly a church, with a congregation that was never seen again, and with a family whose name has been erased from history, yet whose shadow lingers still. The bells toll once more, slow, hollow, like a warning, fade into darkness. To understand the Hudson family, we must first step back, into the woods, into the marshes, into the town that time erased, a place once known as Greyhaven. Greyhaven was settled in the early 1800s, nestled between 2 rivers in upstate New York. At first, it thrived: lumber mills, a modest railway stop, and farmland stretching into the horizon. But unlike other towns that grew into cities, Greyhaven was different. It stayed hidden, its name barely appearing on state records. Maps rarely marked it, and those who passed through often remembered nothing but an unsettling quiet. Travelers spoke of narrow streets where windows stayed shuttered even at noon, of neighbors who whispered more than they spoke, of children who vanished after dusk and whose names were never written into church books. The Hudson family arrived here in 1811, and their church quickly became the heart of the community. At least that's what the records claim. But oral histories, scraps of testimony gathered years later, paint a darker picture. They describe Greyhaven as a place of silence, a town where no laughter echoed and no bells rang without consequence. The people of Greyhaven learned early that salvation came at a price, and that price was secrecy. By the late 19th century, Greyhaven was already unraveling. Families abandoned their homes without explanation. Businesses shuttered overnight. And by the 1920s, the town itself was scrubbed from maps entirely, as if it had never existed. Today, little remains: rotting timbers swallowed by ivy, stone foundations barely visible under moss, and, deep within, the woods, the broken skeleton of the Hudson family church, its altar split, its pews blackened with mold. But in the silence of Greyhaven, some say the faint tolling of bells can still be heard. Every town has a beginning. For Greyhaven, it was not the mills, nor the river. It was a man, a preacher whose words burned hotter than fire and colder than stone. His name was Reverend Elias Hudson. Elias Hudson arrived in Greyhaven in the spring of 1811. Records describe him as a tall, angular man with piercing eyes and a voice that carried even in silence. He did not come alone. His wife, Miriam, and their 3 young daughters traveled with him, along with a modest following of loyal believers who had abandoned their homes in Albany to join him. The townsfolk welcomed him cautiously, but Elias quickly won their trust. His sermons were unlike anything they had heard, measured, hypnotic, and filled with promises of salvation that felt personal, even intoxicating. He preached of purity, obedience, and sacrifice. To the widows he spoke of comfort, to the orphans, of family, and to the men of wealth and stature he offered discretion. The Hudsons built their church on a hill overlooking the river. It was modest at first. White clapboards, a small steeple, but within years it grew into a grand structure, larger than Greyhaven itself seemed to require. Elias claimed it was built with the generosity of God's chosen. Others whispered of strangers arriving at night, men in carriages with polished boots and veiled faces, bringing not just money, but power. But something was strange about these sermons. Parishioners reported doors being locked from within. The windows shuttered, even in daylight. Hymns sung in strange, discordant tones that echoed long after the service ended. Children were told not to approach the church after dark for fear of disturbing the holy work within. Elias Hudson was not just a preacher, he was a builder of something darker, something that would bind Greyhaven in silence for over a century. Every church has an altar, but beneath the Hudson family church there was something else, something no scripture could bless. Stories of the basement began with children. In the 1820s, when the Hudson Church was at its peak, young boys dared each other to slip inside after dusk. They spoke of a narrow staircase behind the pulpit, hidden by a wooden panel. Some claimed they heard muffled cries rising through the floorboards during Sunday sermons. Others swore they smelled wine and perfume drifting upward. Strange scents for a house of God. Years later, testimony from one survivor confirmed what the children only guessed. Beneath the altar lay a chamber swathed in red velvet and candlelight. The pews above echoed with hymns, while below the sounds were far different. Whispers, laughter, the clinking of glasses. And in those velvet rooms, Greyhaven's orphans and widows were not worshippers. They were offerings. The Hudsons had constructed more than a church. They had built a brothel disguised as holy ground, hidden from the eyes of ordinary townsfolk. Behind those locked doors, traveling elites, judges, merchants, even elected officials slipped into the basement under the cover of prayer. There, sins were committed that no confession could absolve. The walls were lined with velvet curtains to muffle sound. Chains were fixed to the stone, half hidden by tapestries depicting saints. The hymns sung above were timed to disguise what happened below, every chorus drowning out a cry, every sermon concealing a transaction. The Hudson family preached salvation, but their true gospel was control, body, spirit, and silence, and those who entered the basement rarely left unchanged. Some never left at all. The staircase was sealed by dawn, the panel replaced, the altar scrubbed clean. To the congregation, nothing had happened. But beneath their prayers, the velvet shadows kept their secrets. What the Hudsons understood better than anyone was this: sin is easiest to hide beneath the veil of virtue. And so, they became Greyhaven's saints. By the 1830s, the Hudson family had established themselves as pillars of the community. Elias Hudson was the town's spiritual leader, guiding funerals, baptisms, and marriages with an almost theatrical tenderness. His wife, Miriam, was celebrated for her charity, offering food and shelter to widows and lost children. Their daughters were praised for their beauty, refinement, and apparent devotion to God. On the surface, the Hudsons were everything a Christian family should be. They gave alms, organized town festivals, and even funded the small schoolhouse. The church itself became a hub, not just for prayer, but for decisions about trade, farming, and law. It was impossible to live in Greyhaven without, in some way, living under the shadow of the Hudsons. But beneath this veneer, the family's true work flourished. The velvet-draped basement expanded. The orphans brought into their care were quietly absorbed into a system of exploitation. Those who resisted were said to be adopted by distant families, but their names never reappeared in census records. Town leaders, bankers, merchants, and even the sheriff were complicit. They attended the Sunday sermons above, then descended into the hidden chambers below. Their involvement ensured silence. To question the Hudsons was to risk your livelihood, your family, even your life. And so, the church became untouchable. Every act of charity masked an act of control. Every blessing bought another layer of secrecy. The Hudsons preached that Greyhaven was chosen by God, but what they truly meant was that Greyhaven was theirs. Every soul, every body, every silence, they owned it all. The brothel beneath the altar remained invisible, not because it was hidden, but because the entire town had been taught never to look. The purest mask the Hudsons ever wore was charity, and their greatest victims were the children who trusted them. The Hudson family ran what they called the House of Mercy, an orphanage connected to their church. To the outside world, it was an act of compassion. Widows who could not provide, farmers too poor to raise another mouth, travelers who lost children to illness, all turned to the Hudsons, and the Hudsons accepted them eagerly. But behind closed doors, these children became property. The youngest were put to work scrubbing floors and tending fires. The older ones, especially the girls, were selected for the church's hidden basement. Official records claim the orphans were adopted into respectable families across the state, but decades later, survivors whispered otherwise. They spoke of being paraded before wealthy strangers, their futures bartered like cattle at market. Some were kept as servants, others were never seen again. One woman, known only as Clara M., gave a harrowing testimony in 1882 before disappearing. She described being locked in velvet rooms, drugged with sweet-tasting tonics, and told that obedience was the same as faith. Every client she served was masked. Every hymn above her head reminded her that silence meant survival. And yet, when these children were paraded on Sundays, clean-faced, dressed in white, they were presented as miracles of Hudson charity. The congregation saw smiling orphans, unaware that their smiles were rehearsed, their eyes hollow. The orphans were called God's children, but to the Hudsons they were merchandise. Flesh disguised as innocence, prayer recited as obedience, and for those who resisted, there was only disappearance. The House of Mercy stood for nearly 60 years. By the time it closed, not a single trace of its records remained. Every name erased, every file burned, every child forgotten. Every town has a day it cannot forget. For Greyhaven, that day came in the autumn of 1834, the Sunday service that began like any other, but never truly ended. That morning, the Hudson family church was filled to capacity. 60 or more gathered, farmers, wives, children, all dressed in their Sunday best. Reverend Elias Hudson stood at the pulpit, his voice carrying through the rafters as the bells tolled. The doors were locked behind them, as was customary. But this time, they never opened again. Neighbors waiting outside the church described hearing hymns that lasted deep into the night. At first, it seemed like devotion, but by midnight the voices were strange, slurred, discordant, as if the singers were no longer themselves. Then came silence. By dawn, the families of those inside gathered, pounding on the doors. When the church finally opened, the pews were empty. No bodies, no congregation, only the faint warmth of seats recently occupied, and the smell of burned wax and perfume. The Hudsons explained it away. Elias claimed God had taken the faithful into his embrace, that a miracle had occurred. To the grieving families, this was no comfort, but to speak against the Hudsons was dangerous. Within days, dissenters were silenced. Some fled Greyhaven entirely. Others, who dared accuse the family of deceit, were found drowned in the river or hanging in their barns. The event was later remembered as the Sunday that never ended. The children left behind grew up haunted, their lives marked by the shadow of that day. No grave was ever dug. No death was ever recorded. The Hudsons called it rapture, but the people of Greyhaven knew it for what it was: erasure. An entire congregation swallowed whole. The church bells never rang the same again. What happens when law and faith collide? In Greyhaven, the answer was always the same. The law bowed its head and kept silent. In the months after the Sunday that never ended, whispers of foul play began to spread beyond Greyhaven. Relatives from neighboring towns demanded answers. How could dozens of men, women, and children vanish without trace? Why was there no inquiry, no graves, no explanation beyond divine rapture? At first, the county sheriff began to take statements. A deputy even filed preliminary charges of fraud and unlawful imprisonment against Elias Hudson. But the case went nowhere. Within weeks, the files disappeared. Witnesses recanted or vanished, and the deputy himself was found dead in his home, his throat slit, the words "God's judgment" scrawled on the wall in his own blood. Over the next decade, multiple investigations were attempted. State officials sent inspectors to Greyhaven, but none returned with reports. One clerk later confessed that his superior had ordered him to burn evidence relating to the Hudson family. The reason? A judge in Albany, one of the Hudsons' most loyal patrons, had intervened. Those who spoke openly were punished swiftly. Farmers who questioned the family lost their land overnight. A young mother who accused the Hudson daughters of taking her child was found hanging in her barn. Her death ruled suicide. It was not that the truth was unknown. It was that the truth was unspeakable. The Hudson family was not just above the law. They were the law. By the 1840s, the phrase, "Don't ask, don't answer," had become a bitter mantra in Greyhaven. Silence was the only protection. And so the disappearances continued, unchecked, undocumented, unquestioned. The Hudson's church stood untouched, and its basement, sealed by velvet curtains, grew busier than ever. Faith is carried in song, but in Greyhaven, song became something else: a weapon, a curse, a hymn of red. Survivors of the Hudson Church, few though they were, spoke of a chant unlike any other. It began softly, woven into familiar hymns. But as the service stretched on, the melody twisted. Voices sank into strange harmonies, each note pulling the congregation deeper into something they did not understand. They called it the Red Hymn. No one could write it down. Those who tried described their ink running dry, their hands shaking uncontrollably. One witness claimed the very act of remembering it gave him violent nosebleeds. Yet the memory persisted. Oh, in dreams. The hymn was not sung every Sunday. It was reserved for special gatherings, nights when the church doors were locked and the windows blackened. From beneath the altar, faint cries could be heard, masked by the rising chorus above. The notes seemed to merge with the human voice until it was no longer clear whether the congregation was singing or screaming. Decades later, asylum records reveal patients from Greyhaven who muttered fragments of the song in their sleep. Doctors noted their pupils dilated as if in trance, their pulse racing. Several suffered seizures when confronted with church bells, as though the memory of the hymn had burned itself into their nervous system. They called it the Red Hymn because once you heard it, you could not wash it away. It stained the mind, it colored the soul, and those who followed its rhythm often never returned. Some believed the hymn was more than music, that it was a ritual, a coded prayer to something older than Scripture. Whether hymn or curse, its echo never left Greyhaven. Even today, wanderers who stumble upon the church's ruins claim to hear faint singing in the wind. Behind every sermon, behind every hymn, there were the daughters. 3 women raised not as children of God, but as instruments of their Father's will. The daughters of Reverend Elias Hudson, Anne, Celeste, and Lydia were described as radiant. By their late teens, they were spoken of as angels of Greyhaven, admired for their composure, their delicate voices, their striking presence at Sunday services. To the congregation, they were living proof of the Hudson family's grace. But their roles were far from innocent. The daughters were not just ornaments of the church, they were its gatekeepers. Anne, the eldest, became known for her soft, persuasive charm. She welcomed newcomers to Greyhaven, often leading them personally into the church's inner circle. Celeste, the middle child, was described as calculating, her gaze sharp enough to cut through suspicion. She managed the adoptions of orphans, arranging which children would vanish and when. Lydia, the youngest, embodied allure, trained to seduce men of power, to bind them to the Hudson family with promises of secrecy and pleasure. Within the velvet-draped basement, the daughters ruled as silent overseers. They greeted guests in masks, led rituals disguised as prayers, and ensured obedience among the orphans. Survivors later whispered that the daughters never raised their voices, yet their presence was more terrifying than Elias's sermons. They were adored by townsfolk who saw only their public faces, graceful, modest, untouchable. But behind closed doors they were feared, whispered about as the madams of the altar. Local women avoided them, believing their very touch carried curses. The Hudson daughters were not victims of their father's corruption. They were heirs to it. They carried it forward, not with fire and force, but with beauty, silence, and control. And as their influence grew, the Hudson Church became less a sanctuary and more a fortress. When the trial ended, the newspapers eventually stopped printing her name. Velma Barfield was gone, her story buried under newer scandals and tragedies. But in the small towns where she once lived, her presence lingered. Neighbors whispered of strange knocks on doors at night, of medicine bottles tipping over without cause, of the faint smell of medicine drifting through empty rooms. Some believed it was guilt haunting the land, others swore it was Velma herself, still searching for another victim. Families who lost loved ones never fully healed. Their grief turned into silence, a silence passed down through generations. Children grew up never knowing why their grandparents refused to speak of certain winters, or why they never touched the rocking chair that once sat in Velma's porch. The state may have executed her body, but something darker remained. A reminder that evil can wear a grandmother's smile, and that sometimes the most terrifying monsters don't hide in the woods. They sit across from you at the dinner table. Time moved on, and history tried to forget Velma Barfield. New generations read only brief mentions of her name in dusty crime archives. But for those who studied her case, the lesson was chillingly clear. Monsters do not always appear as shadows in the night. Sometimes they wear aprons, smile sweetly, and pray in church pews. Velma's story revealed how trust itself can be turned into a weapon. She poisoned not strangers, but the very people who believed in her. Family, lovers, neighbors. Her killings were not driven by passion or madness alone, but by the cold calculation of someone who knew how much people wanted to believe in kindness. And perhaps that is why her memory still unsettles us. Because the true terror of Velma Barfield is not just in what she did, but in how easily she could have been sitting in any of our homes, offering us tea with a gentle smile, while hiding death inside the cup. Velma Barfield's execution closed the chapter of her life, but her story never truly ended. Even today, criminologists and psychologists study her case, not only to understand how a woman could mask such darkness, but also to see how society failed to recognize the signs. Her case was a warning to hospitals, caretakers, and families. Sometimes the person holding your hand is the very one tightening the noose around your life. Velma taught the world that evil doesn't always come with rage or violence. It can come with prayer books, soft voices, and warm meals. And so, the name Velma Barfield lingers like a ghost in American true crime history. She is remembered not just as a murderer, but as a reminder of the fragile line between love and betrayal, between faith and fear, between life and death. Decades have passed since Velma Barfield's execution, yet her story continues to haunt the American South. In small towns, whispers of her crimes still linger. Elderly patients sometimes shiver when a nurse brings them tea, and families remember the chilling lesson. Evil often wears a mask of kindness. Velma became more than a criminal. She became a symbol of betrayal, of misplaced trust, and of the dangers that lurk behind closed doors. Historians and storytellers call her the Grandma Killer, but those who knew her still struggled to reconcile the gentle churchwoman with the silent predator. Her grave may be silent, but her story still breathes in documentaries, books, and late-night conversations. Velma Barfield reminds us that monsters are not only found in dark alleys, they can be found sitting beside us, smiling, praying, and waiting for the right moment to strike. Velma Barfield's tale is not just a story of murder. It's a warning carved into history. She showed the world how trust can be weaponized, how faith can be twisted, and how love can become a mask for destruction. Her crimes remind us that evil rarely announces itself with a roar. Instead, it whispers, it comforts, it hides in plain sight. Velma smiled, prayed, and held hands with her victims, moments before poisoning them. The question that remains is unsettling. How many Velmas still walk among us today? Her story ends in 1984, but the fear she inspired will live forever. Some locals in North Carolina still whisper about Velma Barfield. They claim her restless soul never left the prison grounds where she took her final breath. Guards reported strange chills in her former cell, lights flickering and an eerie scent of bitter medicine lingering in the air. Even decades later, stories spread of a shadowy figure of an old woman walking the halls at night, muttering prayers under her breath. Whether it's just folklore or something darker, one thing is certain. Velma's legacy is not only written in crime history, but also etched into the nightmares of those who remember her. History remembers Velma Barfield as the praying grandma killer, but not everyone remembers the names of those she poisoned. Behind every victim was a family torn apart, children left without parents, and lives shattered forever. Old newspapers reveal faded photographs of her victims, their faces staring back like silent ghosts, pleading not to be forgotten. Some families still refuse to speak of her, claiming it brings bad luck. Others keep the memories alive, warning future generations. Evil can wear the mask of kindness. Velma may have been executed, but the echoes of her victims still whisper through time. After Velma Barfield's execution, the prison where she spent her final days reported strange phenomena. Guards whispered about cold drafts in sealed hallways, footsteps echoing when no one was there, and the faint smell of medicine drifting through the air. Visitors swore they saw an elderly woman in a faded hospital gown praying in the chapel, only for her figure to vanish when approached. Even the cemetery where some of her victims were buried is said to be haunted. Locals claim to hear crying voices at night, and some graves are found disturbed, as if the dead are restless. It's as though Velma's crimes left a permanent scar, not just on history, but on the very soil of North Carolina. Velma Barfield's story didn't end with her death. In North Carolina, her name still carries a chill. Some say if you whisper it 3 times in the dark, you'll hear a faint cough behind you, the same one her victims heard before their final breath. Folklore claims her spirit roams hospitals and nursing homes, searching for new souls to claim. Nurses have reported patients screaming about an old woman with medicine, standing at their bedside just before they die. Whether ghost story or lingering evil, one thing is certain. Velma Barfield wasn't just a killer. She became a legend of death itself, proof that sometimes the past refuses to stay buried. Prisons are meant to bury the sins of the condemned. Yet Velma Barfield's cell was never silent. Guards swore they heard prayers whispered long after her execution, a desperate voice begging God for mercy. Even decades later, tourists and paranormal investigators flocked to North Carolina, hunting for traces of her spirit. Some claimed they've captured recordings, an old woman's voice saying, "I didn't mean to." But the question remains, was Velma Barfield a woman destroyed by addiction and guilt, or a monster who used faith as a mask? One truth will always remain. The fear she left behind is eternal. Her shadow still lingers, reminding us that evil often hides behind the most familiar